I didn't tell anyone who I was when I moved in. Not because I was hiding, just because I was tired. After 3 decades managing municipal infrastructure, flood controls, pipeline design, and utility systems across 3 states, I'd seen enough bureaucracy breakdowns and backroom deals to last a lifetime. I was ready for something simple, quiet, predictable. So when I found the house on Sycamore Ridge, a cedar-sided bungalow nestled between the trees with a wraparound porch and a trickle of a stream running out back, I didn't think twice. It was at the edge of a gated neighborhood called Brook Hollow Reserve, one of those semi-private HOAs that prided itself on community values and aesthetic consistency. Their signs were polished. Their flower beds were immaculate. Their newsletters had calligraphy headers. I signed the papers, closed the deal, and moved in mid-March with a single trailer of furniture and a dog named Rex. A few neighbors waved politely. Some didn't wave at all. That was fine by me. I wasn't here to socialize, just to breathe. At first, everything was smooth. The nights were cool. The mornings smelled like pine. I spent most of my time patching up the deck, repainting the gutters, and trimming back the overgrowth around the old water meter at the end of the drive. Nothing urgent, just the kind of slow, satisfying labor that comes after a lifetime of meetings and stress. No one bothered me, no one knocked, until they did. It started with a note, typed, folded, taped to my door. Dear resident, please be advised that your grass exceeds the allowable height per Brook Hollow Guidelines, Section 2B14. Kindly correct this by Friday to avoid citation. Thank you, Community Compliance Committee. I stood there reading it in my work boots, covered in sawdust, while Rex barked at a squirrel under the porch. The grass in question, maybe 5 inches tall. 2 days of rain and a weekend of housework had kept me from mowing. I had already planned to cut it that evening. I tossed the paper in the trash. The next day I met Karen. She came up the walk like she owned it. Blonde bob, oversized sunglasses, HOA badge clipped to her cardigan like it was a police shield. You must be the new homeowner, she said with a practiced smile. I'm Karen Holt, chair of the Brook Hollow Aesthetic Compliance Committee. Nice to meet you, I said, wiping my hands on a towel. I'm sure you saw our note about the grass. I did. I'll mow it tonight. She tilted her head. We ask that residents keep up with appearances. It really affects the property values. I looked past her to my neighbor's house, faded shutters, a cracked driveway, and a lawn flaming with dandelions. I'll keep that in mind, I said. She sniffed. And the fence out back, it looks rusted. It's original to the property, I replied. Still sturdy, just aged. Well, she said we do have a guideline about visible wear. I can have someone send you the full compliance binder. No need, I said. I'm not in your HOA. Her smile cracked. I'm sorry. I'm outside the covenant line. Lot 141. Deeded separately when the land was first divided. I confirmed it before I bought. She blinked, but the mailbox is standard. Voluntarily installed by the previous owner. She straightened up. Well, even if you're not formally a member, we do ask that neighbors cooperate in maintaining community standards. That's a request, I said, folding my arms. Not a requirement. Karen didn't like that. She mumbled something about setting a tone and cooperation, and then turned on her heel and marched back to her golf cart, tires crunching on gravel like a warning. I figured that was the end of it. I mowed the grass, repainted the fence with a matte black rust protectant just to quiet the criticism. And for the next few days I went about my life like normal morning coffee afternoon repairs the occasional trip into town. Then the water stopped. No pressure, no warning. Just a cough from the faucet and a gurgle from the pipes and nothing. I checked the main valve, still open. I checked the lines, no leaks. I called the local water company. They confirmed there were no outages in my area. In fact, they said I wasn't even on their current grid. That's when I remembered. This house was old, older than the rest of the development. Built before the HOA, before the gated roads and committee signs and flower beds. And with that age came quirks, including a private well access point buried beneath a capped vault near the back fence. But the system had been modernized. 10 years ago, the original developer had sold the local water grid to a private utility company. That company went under during a financial crash. Then the grid was auctioned off, pipe, pumps, access rights, everything. And I had bought it. Not intentionally at first, just as part of an investment strategy. One of my old friends in municipal utilities had tipped me off. A handful of forgotten service zones were up for grabs, low cost, low conflict, low return. But I'd always believed in infrastructure. Now staring at my shut-off valve, I realized I had purchased something far more powerful than I'd thought. I didn't just own a few yards of pipe. I owned the entire local grid, every pump station, every underground conduit, every maintenance hatch and pressure regulator that fed Brook Hollow's manicured lawns and trickling fountains. Karen didn't know it yet, but when she shut off my water, she'd messed with the one person who could shut off hers too, and everyone else's. After discovering the water had been shut off and remembering that I still legally owned the grid, I did something most people wouldn't expect. I didn't retaliate. Not yet. I called it an assessment phase. I needed to know exactly what I was up against, how deep the HOA's sense of entitlement went, and whether this was an isolated abuse or part of something broader and more sinister. I wanted to give them a chance to correct their mistake before things got serious. But Karen didn't want reconciliation. She wanted control. The morning after the shutdown, I visited the old concrete service bunker hidden behind a thicket of yaupon holly at the edge of the property. The rusted utility hatch opened with a grunt and a crowbar. Inside, the original manual valves, long since upgraded with modern smart meters and digital pressure regulators, still bore the stenciled numbers of the original district grid, 37A to 37F. And the pump humming quietly in the dark was mine. Literally. Stamped into the side of the brass manifold, Carter Utility Como, private property, easement, secured. No question, no ambiguity. The HOA had tapped into my infrastructure without ever reading the fine print, and now one of their own had the arrogance to shut off my connection to a system I legally owned. So I did what any professional would do. I documented everything. Photos, meter readings, flow records, GPS-tagged images of all access panels and control switches. I wanted to be calm, prepared, surgical. That afternoon, while I was tightening a panel on the western side valve station, I heard the familiar electric hum of a golf cart approaching. I didn't have to look up. Karen. She stopped at the edge of the property line, arms folded like a school principal about to reprimand a stubborn student. I heard you've been tinkering with things again, she said. I looked up from the panel, wiped my hands on a rag, and stood, just inspecting the infrastructure. Her lips twitched. That's community property. I blinked. Come again. She stepped forward, sandals clicking on the paved sidewalk. That entire zone is part of the Brook Hollow shared utility corridor. You can't just make adjustments. I took out my phone and pulled up the county land registry. This parcel, private land. This equipment, privately owned infrastructure, easement, registered in my name. Karen didn't even glance at the screen. That doesn't matter, she snapped. The community relies on the system. The HOA governs all shared resources. I couldn't help but smile. The HOA governs what's within its covenant, which, as I've told you before, stops 30 yards from here. She scoffed. It's all semantics. No, Karen. It's all legal ownership. Her cheeks flushed a deep pink. She pulled a piece of paper from her clipboard and waved it in my direction. This is a non-compliance citation, she declared. You're interfering with vital systems without HOA approval. I've notified the board. If you don't cease operations immediately, we'll be forced to take further action. I took the paper, read it silently, then chuckled. You typed this yourself, didn't you? She stiffened. There's no seal, no board signature, no legal reference, just your name and a bolded threat. She reached for the paper, but I folded it and tucked it into my pocket. Consider this received, I said, and irrelevant. You're pushing boundaries, she warned. You're endangering the community. No, I said calmly, you are. When you shut off my water, you accessed a control point without permission. That's tampering. It's also trespassing under both state and federal utility law. She stared at me, lips twitching with rage, but I wasn't finished. I'll give you a chance to correct it. Restore service. Issue a written apology. And maybe, just maybe, we'll move on. Karen's mouth opened like she wanted to object, but no words came out. I stepped closer, voice low. Or you can keep pushing, and we'll see what happens when the rest of this neighborhood finds out I own every inch of pipe beneath their pristine lawns. Her silence was the first honest thing I'd heard from her. She turned without another word and sped off in her golf cart, tires skidding on the asphalt. That night, I got a text from Leonard Whitmore, the HOA's vice chair, a quiet man I'd seen in meetings but never spoken to directly. Hey, sorry about Karen. Can we talk tomorrow? I didn't reply immediately. Instead, I walked down to the pump house, turned on the access light, and stared at the master valve, the one that controlled the main line feeding half the neighborhood, including Karen's side street. I didn't touch it. Not yet. But I thought about what it would sound like to shut it off. And I slept better than I had in weeks. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. Habit mostly. Years of field inspections and early shift rotations will do that to a man. But this morning, there was a different kind of charge in the air, like something was brewing beneath the surface, as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath without knowing why. I walked into the kitchen, turned the tap, and as expected, nothing. No water. No pressure, no trickle, no hiss, just silence. I didn't panic. I didn't cuss or stomp or call the HOA hotline that I knew would just route me to a voicemail box titled Community Concerns. Instead, I walked out back with a clipboard of my own. The sun was rising slow over the ridge, casting long shadows across the service bunker. I opened the hatch, climbed down the steel ladder, and double-checked the flow meters. All valves operational. No error codes. The internal diagnostics showed system health at 97%. My connection was intact, which meant someone had manually closed the exterior gate valve. I followed the conduit pathway, tracing it up to the street-side access panel. And there it was. A fresh lock, zip-tied to the panel handle. Cheap hardware store brass, the kind of thing someone buys in a hurry to make themselves feel authoritative. Hanging from it, a laminated card with bold red letters, "Do not tamper," by order of HOA Infrastructure Compliance. And underneath, scrawled in permanent marker, "Non-compliant property, pending enforcement review." Karen Dobo. I stared at it for a long moment. It wasn't just petty. It was criminal. She had no jurisdiction, no authority, and now she had made it official. This was trespass, sabotage, and under state utility code, a clear violation of easement rights, especially against a registered owner of private infrastructure. I didn't remove the lock. Not yet. Instead, I took photos, close-ups, wide angles. I recorded a short video documenting the entire panel and the surrounding easement line marked clearly by stakes I'd driven into the ground last year when I surveyed the area. Then I drove into town. There's a little municipal records office behind the county courthouse, half buried in paperwork and forgotten by most of the world. But I knew it well. I'd pulled permits there, filed restoration bonds, acquired a half-dozen rural utility easements back when no one else saw their value. I handed the clerk a folder with everything my deed, my infrastructure, purchased, the utility survey map, and a thumb drive with documentation. By lunchtime, I had two things. 1. A formal complaint filed with the county against the Brook Hollow HOA for unauthorized interference with private utility systems. And 2. A cease and desist order, signed and stamped, that gave me legal grounds to demand immediate restoration of service. I drove home slow. Let the silence marinate. When I pulled into my drive, there were 3 HOA board members standing near the street panel, Leonard among them, looking uncomfortable. Karen wasn't there, but her presence lingered in the form of defensive posture and poorly concealed panic. Leonard approached as I stepped out of the truck. "We, heard there was an issue." "You heard right," I said, holding out the order. He took it, read the heading, and muttered something under his breath. One of the other board members, Pamela, I think, folded her arms. "This is a misunderstanding." Karen believed. Karen acted, I interrupted, without authority, without cause, on a system she doesn't own, that she doesn't even understand. "We didn't know the grid was privately held," Pamela said weakly. "And yet, you approved someone cutting off my service." She looked away. Leonard cleared his throat. "Can we talk, just us?" I gave him a long look, then nodded. We walked to the edge of the creek while the other 2 stayed behind, flipping through the paperwork like it might start glowing with answers. Leonard rubbed his temples. "Look, I'm not defending her. She's out of line. But the board's under pressure. Residents have been complaining about inconsistent water pressure. Someone told her you were altering the system." "I was maintaining it," I said flatly. "Which is my right. You're pulling water from a network you don't own on land you don't manage, using a system I paid to upgrade." He nodded. "I believe you, honestly. I just didn't know. Karen never told us. She doesn't know either. She just thinks she does." Leonard sighed. "What happens now?" "I'm giving you 24 hours, I said. "To restore my service, remove every unauthorized lock or marker on my property, and issue a public acknowledgement of ownership stating that the HOA has no jurisdiction over the grid. And if we don't," I looked him square in the eyes, "I shut down the flow to the entire subdivision." Leonard blinked. "I have the right," I said. "For maintenance, for safety, for review. The easement agreement gives me full control. You want to push?" I push back. but harder, and I don't stop at sprinklers. He didn't argue. He didn't bargain. He just nodded once. Later that evening, the lock was gone. The water flowed again, but the message had already been sent. And in the dark silence of my backyard, I stood beside the creek and stared up at the stars, knowing that peace was temporary and Karen was not done. But neither was I. The next morning, before the sun crested over the tree line, I stood beside the pump house and listened. There's a certain kind of hum a well-maintained water grid makes, a steady vibration, low and constant, like the breath of something ancient and mechanical. It's the sound of pressure equalizing through buried pipes, of valves doing their job, of the earth exhaling after long tension. That morning, the hum was clean. Karen's lock was gone. My water pressure was back to normal. But the damage wasn't just mechanical. It was political, psychological, and deeply revealing. Because what I realized in those early hours, as dew clung to the wild grass and a mockingbird scolded me from a fence post, was this: nobody in this community actually knew who owned the grid. Not the board, not the residents, not even the company Karen claimed had built the original development. The entire HOA operated on assumption. For years, they'd drawn water-managed landscaping, installed irrigation, all from infrastructure they didn't control. Somewhere along the way, that unspoken access had calcified into entitlement. And when I quietly reclaimed my own service line, they reacted not with curiosity, but with vengeance. So I decided it was time they learned, but not through confrontation, through clarity. I spent the next 2 days reviewing every easement and utility record tied to the Brook Hollow subdivision. Most were outdated, filed during the housing boom of the early 2000s, when private utility companies collapsed and municipalities sold off their holdings to balance budgets. That's how I'd acquired the grid in the first place, part of a distressed asset package, bundled with 2 small power substations and a redundant water line that fed a neighboring ranch. I'd nearly forgotten about it until Karen forced my hand. I printed a new ownership map, color-coded to show all active and inactive segments of the system. I highlighted access panels, cutoff points, and private vaults. I even overlaid it with satellite imagery to show which homes were directly fed through my grid. Answer: all of them. Brook Hollow relied 100% on my infrastructure. They didn't have a backup, and they didn't even know it. That Friday, I sent an email to Leonard. Subject: Brook Hollow, Utility System Ownership Confirmation. Leonard, per our conversation, please find attached the full map of Carter Utility Infrastructure Holdings in and around Brook Hollow Reserve. As you can see, all primary water lines, pressure regulators, and service feeds within your community boundaries originate from systems I currently own and maintain under state easement law. I am willing to enter into a formal access agreement with the HOA to continue uninterrupted service contingent upon clear acknowledgement of ownership and lawful cooperation moving forward. I will await the board's written response by Monday. Regards, M. Carter. I didn't expect a reply right away, but I didn't expect what came next either. That evening, someone pounded on my door. Not knocked, pounded. Rex barked before I even reached the porch. I opened the door, slowly, hand on the edge, and there she was. Karen. Hair swept into a tight ponytail, eyes wide with the kind of fury reserved for people who've realized they are no longer in control. You can't do this, she hissed. Do what? This declaration. Sending emails to the board. Acting like you own the whole neighborhood. I don't own the neighborhood, I said calmly. Just the grid under it. Her lip trembled. You think you're clever, that you can just hold us hostage because you bought some old plumbing in a tax sale? I said nothing. You're not a utility company, she barked. You don't have a license. You're just some old man with a vendetta. I let the words hang in the air like smoke. Then I stepped out onto the porch slowly, evenly, until we were only a few feet apart. Karen, I said. Voice low, do you know what a private utility easement is? She blinked. It's not about being a company. It's about being the legal entity responsible for infrastructure maintenance and flow control across designated land, and I am that entity. I pulled a copy of the easement agreement from the folder in my hand and held it out. This was signed by the county in 2014, reaffirmed in 2021. It gives me the right to manage, control, and suspend operations as needed for repair or safety. She didn't take it, but she looked at it, just long enough to read the first few lines. Then she slapped it out of my hand. The pages scattered across the porch, I bent to pick them up without saying a word. "You think you've won?" she said, voice cracking. "You haven't. The board's just scared right now. But they'll come to their senses." I stood dusted off the top page and looked her in the eye. "They will," I said. "That's why I gave them until Monday." Karen stepped back, her fury colliding with something new fear. "You're insane," she muttered. "You're actually insane." And then she turned and walked away. No golf cart this time. Just footsteps on gravel and a long, stunned silence behind her. Later that night, Leonard called. "Karen showed up at your place." "She did. I'm sorry." "I'm not surprised." He sighed into the phone. "We'll respond. Officially. Just give us the weekend. You've got until Monday." I hung up and sat on the porch until midnight, listening to the creak and the hum of water flowing through pipes. No one but me had ever really understood. I hadn't asked for this fight, but I wasn't afraid of it either, because I knew what they didn't. Infrastructure isn't power until it's tested. And now the pressure was building. Monday morning arrived with the kind of stillness that usually precedes a storm. No wind, no birdsong, just the soft creak of my porch swing and the slow drip of dew falling from the edge of the gutter. I sat there with my coffee dressed the same way I had every morning since the fight began. Plain flannel worn jeans, boots that still held the red dust of 100 underground vaults. At precisely 8:04 a.m., my phone rang. It wasn't Leonard. It wasn't even a local number. The caller ID simply read, "Blocked." I answered anyway. Mr. Carter, a clipped voice said on the other end. "This is Morgan Whitley, counsel for Brook Hollow Reserve HOA." Of course, the lawyers were finally awake. "We've reviewed the documents you submitted to the board," she continued. "We acknowledge receipt of your easement claim utility survey and ownership transfer of Grid 37. However, we have some concerns regarding the tone and implications of your communication." I took a sip of my coffee. "Go on." "There appears to be an implied threat," she said, "that if the HOA does not respond favorably, you may choose to suspend water services to the entire neighborhood. Would you care to clarify your intentions for the record?" I chuckled softly. "I intend to maintain lawful control of my infrastructure," I said. "If that includes scheduled safety inspections, pressure testing, or valve recalibration that interrupts service, that's within my rights." "So you're confirming that you have the capability to shut down water service to Brook Hollow?" "I'm confirming that I own the system through which that water flows. If a section of pipe begins to fail or a pump overheats, I'll shut it down immediately for safety, of course." There was a long pause. "Is this your idea of negotiation?" she asked. "No," I said. "This is my idea of responsibility. Something your board lost sight of a long time ago." Another pause. "You realize," she said more quietly, "if you follow through, there will be consequences." "Ms. Whitley," I said calmly, "there already have been." Karen shut off my water without authority. That was trespass and sabotage. She issued false citations, harassed me on my own property, and tampered with public infrastructure. If I wanted to press charges, I could, but I haven't. "Are you threatening to sue?" "No. I'm offering to let this die quietly. All I'm asking is for the HOA to acknowledge the facts, respect the easement, and enter a formal usage agreement. You don't have to like me. You don't have to invite me to block parties, but you will stop acting like you own what you don't. I'll relay your position to the board. You do that." Click. I set the phone down, stretched my legs, and stood. The time for waiting was over. Within the hour, I began preparations. I pulled the inspection checklist from my files, the one required by the state before initiating a maintenance suspension of a neighborhood grid. I logged valve status, water pressure, sediment indicators, and pump cycle irregularities. I photographed cracks in the secondary access vault and documented a slight vibration in the main regulator housing a minor issue, but just enough to justify an official temporary shutdown. At noon, I printed and laminated 24 service notice placards, each one labeled with Utility Maintenance Notice. Carter Utility Grid 37A. Due to safety and performance review, water service will be temporarily suspended for system diagnostics and pressure testing. EST duration 48 hours. Authorized by M. Carter Private Infrastructure Custodian. I posted them along the perimeter of the HOA. Every street entrance, every mailbox cluster, even the community bulletin board near the park. That evening I shut the valve. Not all the way, just enough to bring the flow to a slow, inconvenient trickle. By dawn, the neighborhood was in chaos. I heard it first from my neighbor Glenn. an older gentleman with a knee brace and a sarcastic streak. Sprinklers didn't go off, he grunted as he passed. Karen's lawn looks like a hayfield. I smiled. By noon, I received a flood of calls, some polite, some furious. We don't have water. My shower went cold. Why is the HOA ignoring us? I told every single one the same thing. Contact your board. By mid-afternoon, the HOA group chat was on fire. Leonard texted me once. They're panicking. Good, because maybe now they'd listen. That night, I sat on my porch with a lantern beside me, listening to the chorus of sprinklers coughing dry air into brittle grass. I watched car after car drive past windows rolled down, confused and annoyed. And then I saw it. Karen, standing on her porch in a silk robe, hair-wild cell phone pressed to her ear as she yelled into the void. Rex growled beside me. I patted his head. It's all right, boy, I whispered. She's not in charge anymore. Because for the first time in years, she didn't control the water. I did. It took less than 24 hours for Brook Hollow to feel the pressure, literally and figuratively. Tuesday morning dawned hot and windless. The kind of morning that made lawns thirsty and tempers shorter. By 7:00 a.m., the complaints had already started to roll in. Not to me, I'd rerouted my phone straight to voicemail, but through the HOA message board, which was now a war zone of confusion and blame. Can someone explain why I can't shower before work? My irrigation system's dead, and my zinnias are curling up. I paid my HOA dues. This is unacceptable. Why hasn't Karen said anything? By 8:15, Leonard was at my front gate, sweating through his collar, his phone buzzing non-stop in his hand. I met him on the gravel drive. Tell me you're enjoying this, he muttered, already defeated. Not particularly, I said, but I warned you. He nodded. We're getting calls from every direction, residents, realtors, even the fire marshal. I raised an eyebrow. Fire marshal? Yeah. Turns out Brook Hollow's emergency hydrants also run through your grid. I let that sink in for a moment. Did Karen know that when she shut off my service, she didn't know anything he said, pinching the bridge of his nose? We just assumed the HOA managed the utility contract directly. She never asked, never researched, just acted. That's what she does, I said. She acts, and now everyone else pays for it. Leonard looked exhausted. We need to fix this. You know my terms. He exhaled. The board's meeting in 2 hours. Come by. Present your documents. Show them the system. Let them understand it's real. Is Karen going to be there? He hesitated. She insisted, but I think she's on thin ice. I gave him a long look. Fine, I'll be there. He left, still juggling calls, as he jogged back to his car. I went back inside and grabbed what I'd need: easement maps, flow diagnostics, pressure reports, the county permit, allowing me emergency shutdowns for safety inspections. And the pièce de résistance, a dated letter from the original utility company, long dissolved, naming my firm as the inheritor of infrastructure rights when the system was privatized. They could argue all they wanted, but the facts were irrefutable. At exactly 10:00 a.m., I walked into the Brook Hollow Community Center. The place was packed. Dozens of residents sat fanning themselves with paper programs. Board members stood near a fold-out table, flanked by binders and water bottles. And at the center, like a spider in the middle of her silken web, sat Karen, jaw-tight lips, pursed sunglasses perched on her head like a crown. Leonard motioned me forward. Thank you all for coming, he began. As you know, we're experiencing a disruption in water service across the neighborhood. Today, Mr. Carter is here to explain why and how we fix it. I stepped up to the table and unrolled the first map. This, I said, pointing to the highlighted lines, is your water grid. Every pipe valve and regulator in Brook Hollow, all of it 100% runs through private infrastructure. Mine. There was a murmur in the crowd. I handed out copies of the ownership document, the easement agreement, the maintenance permit. I even showed them the stamped county registry form proving I wasn't just bluffing. I've maintained the system quietly for years, I continued. Never charged a dime. Never asked for recognition. I let things run because they ran fine. I paused, until they didn't. Karen shot to her feet. This is ridiculous, she snapped. You can't just come in here and claim you own our water. I turned toward her. I didn't come in. I've always been here. You just didn't bother to look before you acted. She waved a paper into the air. The HOA has standards, regulations. That's what makes this a community. And your standards don't include shutting off someone's water without due process. Your property was in violation, she barked. You were non-compliant. I was mowing my lawn, not building a toxic waste dump. You shut off my service, trespassed, and then issued a fake citation with your name on it. The crowd was silent. Karen looked around, hoping for backup. None came. Leonard stepped forward. I've reviewed the documents, he said. They're legitimate. The Carter utility grid exists. The easement is valid. And according to county records, he is the sole controller of service access. Someone in the back mumbled, well, damn. Karen turned red. But he can't just shut us off. Yes, I said quietly. I can. And I did. For 2 days. Legally. Safely. Because your actions made it unsafe to operate without a formal agreement. A woman near the front, Pamela, one of the board members, raised her hand. What are you asking for? I passed her a folder. A contract. A shared use agreement. The HOA acknowledges my ownership. Agrees to follow standard protocols for maintenance, access, and communication, and contributes a flat annual fee toward upkeep. In return, I'll guarantee uninterrupted service. Fair fee, someone asked. Minimal, I replied. Less than what you'd pay for a single month of lawn care services. Pamela opened the folder, scanned the pages, and passed it to the next person. Karen was shaking her head, muttering, You're just a bully with pipes. I looked at her. No, Karen, I'm a man who told you 3 times not to cross the line. You didn't listen. Now the line listens to me. Leonard cleared his throat. All in favor of accepting Mr. Carter's proposal and entering into formal agreement. Hands went up, all of them, except Karen's. She looked around and realized the tide was gone. The kingdom had crumbled, and she wasn't queen anymore. By the time I got home from the meeting, the neighborhood had already started to change. It wasn't loud or dramatic, not yet, but it was visible. Lawn crews idled without water access. Garden hoses lay limp on driveways. Sprinkler heads popped up from the grass only to hiss dry air. Kids with water balloons stood confused in swimsuits, while their parents dialed the HOA hotline with increasing urgency. It had been 51 hours since I initiated the legal shutdown for infrastructure inspection. The temperature had climbed into the mid-90s. And now, even the most HOA-loyal residents were beginning to see the full consequences of Karen's recklessness. But Karen herself, she hadn't said a word. No apology. No explanation. Not even a comment on the HOA group page, where residents were venting like a leaking hydrant. Why is the whole neighborhood dry and nobody is answering emails? Was this caused by the new guy with the fence? Karen, if you're reading this, we need answers. I just want to brush my teeth, man. What is going on? That night, I opened my window and heard the faint whirring of backup water pumps generators from a few of the larger homes kicking in to run their private tanks. It was a luxury only a handful could afford. The rest waited. Angry, dry, helpless. Around midnight, I received a message. It wasn't from Leonard. It was from a teenager named Evan. Lives 3 houses down, plays the drums in his garage, helped me haul mulch last fall. Hey, Mr. C. My mom says we might have to go stay at Grandma's because there's no water and HOA can't fix it. But she also said you own the pipes. That true? I typed back, yes, it's true. A few seconds later. Then why'd you shut it off? Fair question, I replied. Because someone cut off mine first. I'm just making repairs legally. It'll be back soon, I promise. He didn't respond after that. But the next morning, his mom waved at me while I watered my raised beds, something no one else in the neighborhood could do. Not because I was taunting them, but because, unlike them, I had built in a backup cistern. Long before this drama started, not a word was said, just a wave, and a quiet nod that felt like understanding. The pressure, both literal and social, was building. At the HOA office, a crowd had formed by noon. I passed by on my way to the feed store and saw at least 20 people clustered at the doors waving printed copies of emails, water bills, and compliance letters. Karen was nowhere to be seen. Pamela stood at the top step with Leonard trying to calm the group. It's temporary, she kept saying. We're finalizing an agreement. But the crowd wasn't interested in paperwork. They wanted blood. Why didn't we know about this sooner? Who gave the HOA power over someone else's infrastructure? Did Karen even check the records before cutting that man's water? Leonard tried to answer, but it was clear the trust had fractured. That evening, Leonard showed up at my gate again. This time, he looked less like a man burdened by a broken system, and more like someone who had found clarity through chaos. We signed, he said, handing me a manila envelope. Unanimous vote, everyone but Karen. Let me guess, I said, opening the packet. She walked out. She resigned. I stopped flipping through the contract. Resigned. He nodded. Effective immediately. Her house is going on the market. Word is she's already talking to realtors in another gated community out by the coast. I couldn't help it, I laughed. Leonard smiled too, then hesitated. There's one more thing. He pulled a smaller envelope from his pocket. Inside was a handwritten letter. I unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was angular sharp, the signature at the bottom. Karen Holt. Mr. Carter, I still don't agree with how you've handled this, but I recognize I acted without full understanding. I allowed authority to cloud judgment. I hope the neighborhood treats you better than I did. Karen. It wasn't a true apology, but it was something. And from Karen, that was a miracle. Leonard left, and I stood on my porch until long after dark holding that letter like a relic of a battle that had finally ended. The next morning, I reopened the valves. I issued a formal, service-restored notice to every mailbox in the neighborhood, not via email, not on cheap printer paper, on parchment-colored cardstock embossed with the Carter Utility Co-Push seal. It read, "To the residents of Brook Hollow Reserve, following the successful completion of scheduled infrastructure inspections and the signing of a formal usage agreement between Carter Utility Holdings and the Brook Hollow HOA full water service has been restored. Thank you for your patience. M's Carter Custodian." Within hours, I heard the sounds of sprinklers spinning garden hoses, hissing, and someone letting out a loud, relieved cheer from 3 houses down. But more than that, I heard silence. Not the tense waiting kind, the good kind. The kind that comes after pressure finally gives way. By Thursday, Brook Hollow was almost back to normal, at least on the surface. The sprinklers hissed softly before dawn. Lawn mowers hummed in sync. A group of retirees played pickleball in the park near the clubhouse like nothing had ever happened. But behind the scenes, the scars were fresh. The HOA board, once a silent machine oiled by compliance and inertia, was now fractured, exposed. Emails had leaked. Homeowners had started asking questions, real questions. The kind that forced the board to confront the years of unchecked authority and blind trust they'd given to one woman. Karen's resignation, though sudden, wasn't enough. The community wanted accountability. So they called a meeting. A real one, public, with a full agenda and a vote. And this time they invited me. At first I wasn't sure if I'd attend. I'd already gotten what I needed, an enforceable service agreement, a formal acknowledgement of my infrastructure rights, and Karen's permanent exit. But something in me, maybe pride, maybe duty, said I needed to see it through. So I showed up. The Brook Hollow clubhouse was packed wall to wall. Folding chairs had been set out in long rows. Ceiling fans turned lazily above. At the front of the room stood Leonard, dressed not in his usual beige HOA polo, but in a plain blue button-up. Pamela sat beside him, clipboard in her lap. And next to her, surprisingly, was Glenn, the sarcastic old neighbor with the knee brace. Apparently, they'd made him interim compliance liaison. He winked when he saw me walk in. The crowd hushed as Leonard cleared his throat and stood. "Good evening, everyone," he began. "We're here tonight to formally address recent events that affected our community's water service and to restructure portions of our HOA operations to ensure nothing like this ever happens again." He gestured toward me. As many of you now know, Mr. Carter, our neighbor and resident of Lot 141, owns the infrastructure that supports Brook Hollow's entire water grid. That includes primary lines, pressure regulators, and easement-controlled service points throughout the subdivision. There were no murmurs this time. No gasps. The crowd had finally accepted it. Leonard continued, "We now have a legal usage agreement in place, thanks to Mr. Carter's cooperation, professionalism, and frankly, patience. That earned me a small wave of polite applause, a few nods, even from people who had once ignored me on the sidewalk. But we also have to acknowledge the failures that got us here," he said. "Failures of communication, of leadership, and of transparency. That starts with us, the board." Pamela stood. "We acted without proper understanding of our infrastructure. We allowed a board member to take unauthorized action against a homeowner which jeopardized emergency response capabilities." She looked down for a moment, then back up. "We owe Mr. Carter and all of you an apology." Glenn stood too. "And we owe the future something better." He handed Leonard a stack of documents. Leonard held up the top page. "This is our proposed amendment to the HOA charter. It limits board enforcement powers strictly to properties under the official covenant, requires a third-party legal review before any utility-related enforcement action is taken, and mandates an annual community audit of infrastructure oversight. Applause this time. Louder, earnest. Leonard glanced toward me. Would you like to speak? I stood slowly, walked to the front, and took a breath. I didn't come here to fight, I said. I came here to retire. To live quietly. To care for the land my infrastructure touches because I believe in stewardship. I paused. What happened these last few weeks was unnecessary, avoidable, and dangerous. Not just to me, but to all of you. When systems are misunderstood, they get abused. And when power goes unchecked, someone always pays the price. I looked around the room, letting my gaze rest on the familiar faces. I'm not your enemy. I never was. But I won't be ignored and I won't be bullied. Another pause. You now have a second chance. Use it. Build a board that listens. Write rules that protect, not punish. And remember, water doesn't care about bylaws. It just flows where it's allowed. I handed the microphone back and returned to my seat. The vote passed with unanimous show of hands. New charter amendment, adopted compliance rules, restructured, oversight committee formed. And just like that, Brook Hollow took its first real step toward becoming the kind of community it always claimed to be. As the crowd dispersed, several residents stopped to shake my hand. One woman brought me a basket of lemons from her yard. A kid in a Spider-Man shirt gave me a thumbs up. But the moment that stayed with me was this. Pamela approached quietly as I packed my documents and said, "We used to call you the grumpy old guy with the tool shed." I smiled. Used to? Now we call you the grid. She laughed, and I couldn't help but laugh too. Because as ridiculous as that nickname sounded, it wasn't wrong. I had become part of this neighborhood's foundation. Not by force, not by ambition, but by resilience. By knowing the ground beneath my feet, and refusing to let anyone tell me otherwise. The water had always flowed beneath them. Now they finally knew who kept it moving. 3 days after the board meeting, I received a knock on the door. Not a clipboard, not a complaint. Just Leonard with 2 cups of coffee and a folder under his arm. No surprises, he said. Just signatures. We sat on the porch in the late afternoon light, the air heavy with the scent of pine sap and distant barbecue. He handed me the folder. Inside were the final notarized pages of the Brook Hollow Utility Usage Agreement. The document that would cement everything we'd battled over for weeks. I read it line by line, even though I already knew every clause. Clause 3.2. Recognition of private ownership. The HOA formally acknowledges that Carter Utility Grid 37 is privately owned, operated, and maintained by M. Carter as per the easement agreement filed with the county in 2014. Clause 4.1. Access limitations. No member of the HOA board or otherwise may access, alter, inspect, or obstruct the grid infrastructure without prior written permission from the owner. Clause 5.7. Annual maintenance contribution. The HOA will contribute an annual maintenance fee earmarked solely for system upkeep and emergency repairs based on per residence use reviewed yearly. Clause 6.3. Breach response. In the event of future tampering or unauthorized action, the owner reserves the right to temporarily suspend service with legal immunity for performance-related interruption. And finally, Clause 7.0. Community Education Program. The board will sponsor 2 annual infrastructure literacy sessions for residents so that what happened here never happens again. I signed. Leonard signed. 2 witnesses from the new oversight committee signed as well. It was done. For the first time since moving to Brook Hollow, I felt the kind of peace that isn't passive but earned. Secured. Guarded by ink and accountability. Leonard lingered after the paperwork was packed away. "You know," he said, sipping from his cup, "you've changed how I see all this." The HOA. He nodded. We got lazy. Hid behind policy. Assumed control meant competence. Common mistake, I said. But we also got blind to our neighbors. To the people quietly holding the community together while we were busy measuring mailbox paint shades. He chuckled. Guess you could say we were thirsty for a wake-up call. I raised my coffee mug. Cheers to that. When he left, I walked the perimeter of my property. Everything was blooming now. Even the areas where the old service trench had been torn open during maintenance, the grass had regrown and the creek flowed with a cleaner curve than before. I paused by the utility shed, ran a hand along the metal edge of the access panel, and smiled. This system, these pipes and valves and pressure tanks, wasn't just infrastructure anymore. It was legacy, a quiet, invisible backbone beneath a town that had finally stopped pretending it knew everything. That weekend, the HOA hosted a small community fair in the park near the lake. Nothing big, just folding tables, a local band, some lemonade stands. Leonard asked if I'd attend. I didn't want to at first, but Rex seemed eager and the air was too nice to waste. So I went. I wore my old utility vest. Not as a statement, just because it had a lot of pockets. People greeted me like they'd known me for years, not effusively, just comfortably. "Hey, Carter, glad to see you. You fixed more than the pipes, you know." Even Evan, the teenager who'd messaged me during the outage, was there. He handed me a flyer. It read, "Infrastructure Matters. Learn how your community runs." Presented by M. Carter, Saturday 2 p.m., Clubhouse Library. Open to all residents. I stared at it. "You planned this?" I asked him. He shrugged. "You said people need to know how things work." I smiled. "I did, didn't I?" He grinned. "I'll bring snacks." It was a strange feeling being folded into something I never asked to join this suburban ecosystem of committees and block parties and kids with lemonade. But now I wasn't just tolerated. I was respected. Later that evening, as the fair wound down and the band packed up their gear, Pamela walked over and stood beside me as I looked out over the lake. "Did you ever think," she said, "you'd be the reason this place actually became a community?" I thought I'd be the reason it cracked apart. She laughed softly. "Funny thing about pressure, it doesn't just break things. Sometimes it forges them." We watched the sun dip below the treetops, the sky melting into gold and rust and quiet. "I still own the grid," I said. She nodded. "And now we finally know who does." Summer turned into fall. The leaves along the creek shifted from green to gold, drifting across the water like silent applause. Kids biked past my fence after school, waving without hesitation. The same path I used to tread alone now came with waves nods, and the occasional question about pressure gauges or backflow valves. I hadn't changed, but they had. And perhaps more than anyone, the land had changed too, not in form, but in meaning. Before, the creek had been just a trickle of water behind my lot. The lake a backdrop. The pipes a hidden system humming beneath our feet. Now they were understood, cared for, respected. Because they had almost been taken for granted, and in that close call, something precious had been born: awareness. And from that awareness, something even rarer had grown: trust. One Sunday afternoon, I was at the shed running a flow test on the east regulator when a quiet knock sounded on the gate. It was Pamela again this time. Without the clipboard, she carried a small box. "I figured you should have this," she said. Inside the box was a plaque. It read, "In recognition of M. Carter, for safeguarding not just the water, but the people. Brook Hollow HOA Community Award, Year 1. I looked up at her. "This is unexpected. Consider it overdue," she said. "We're starting a new annual tradition, honoring one resident who makes a difference without asking for anything back." I didn't know what to say. I'd spent my career in a world where recognition came in service ribbons and quiet nods. This was civilian life catching up in its own humble way. She smiled. "You're the first." I ran my fingers across the engraved letters and nodded. "Thank you." Pamela lingered. "Oh, and the infrastructure class, full house. Evan's flyer worked. People even asked about doing another one for kids next month." That made me smile. "Tell him I'll bring the snacks this time." After she left, I mounted the plaque on the inside of the shed beside the master valve. Not out in the open for display, but where it belonged, at the heart of what mattered. The months rolled on. HOA elections came and went. A few old guard members were replaced with younger residents, more curious than controlling. The oversight committee grew stronger, more inclusive. Policies were rewritten with real input, and I watched quietly as the place I had once nearly walked away from became something rare. Livable. Is human. One crisp winter morning, Leonard stopped by with a question about storm runoff. Not a demand, not a veiled threat, just a neighbor seeking advice. We ended up walking the south edge of the creek where the HOA property met mine. "You ever think you become the town's most important utility?" he joked. I chuckled. "I just didn't want anyone else messing with my pipes." He grinned. "Well, now you've got a contract and a fan club." We paused at a bend in the water where a new footbridge was being built, a shared project between the HOA and the city. My design, my materials, their funding. Cooperation at last. Leonard looked at the stream flowing beneath us. "You know, Karen called me last month." That made me raise an eyebrow. She wanted to know if she could get a reference. I barked a laugh. "Did you give her one?" He shrugged. I told her she taught us all how not to lead. Fair enough. We watched the sun cut across the water, the reflection shimmering like ribbon. Funny I said how all this started with one shut-off valve. Leonard nodded and ended with the whole neighborhood waking up. Later that week, I received a letter in the mail. Handwritten, no return address. It read, Mr. Carter, I've moved on. New place, new board. But I find myself pausing before every decision, now asking if it's necessary, if it's fair, if it's based on understanding instead of assumption. You were right. Power needs checks, and water should flow to everyone. Respectfully, K. I didn't reply. Didn't need to. Instead, I folded the letter, placed it next to the original complaint Karen had filed all those months ago, and tucked both into my file cabinet under a new label. Resolved. Because it was not just the infrastructure agreement, not just the policy reform, but the entire rift, the tension, the mistrust, the misjudgments. All of it had become something else now. Something shared, something earned. And every time I hear the rush of water beneath my land, I'm reminded of that. It's not about owning the grid. It's about what you do when you hold the flow. You can weaponize it, or you can build something better with it. In the end, I chose to build, and in doing so, so did they.